And today I'll be talking about history and theology, neither of which I have a degree in. And I don't represent the Freethinkers, and I don't have anything to sell, and nothing to defend other than my own personal integrity. So we can all just relax and hopefully enjoy this. I have two planned pauses for questions, and after that we'll kind of see what direction it goes. And I'm going to tell a little bit more about myself as I get started. And why I think this is an important question. Because really, on the surface, it seems like a simple question. I think everybody has an answer to what they think fundamentalism is. And when you've heard those, when I've heard the answers to that question, I've heard things like it's a recent phenomena, it's a small subset of religious people, or fundamentalists have hijacked religion, or Christianity today is a corruption of Jesus' original teachings, things like that. And I want to speak to each of those. And we usually are talking about Jesus. Islamic fundamentalism, of course, is also the term that's used. But the Islams recognize Jesus as a prophet. So I'll be focusing on Christianity because I know it best, and I think its role is important. To do this, I'm going to be making a few assertions. I'm going to be talking about the fall of Rome and how we came to define science, which are debatable points, and I realize that, and we don't have hours to debate that. But I'll need to make those to just make the whole thing make sense. So keep in mind that I know that if you say something is right in a scientific sense, you have to be willing to admit that you could be wrong. So I'll leave it up to you to judge if I live up to that. In return, I'll be asking you to apply the principle of charity, which is if you hear I make some historical claim that you disagree with, or some conclusion that I'm stretching the truth a little too far, assume that I've attempted to be accurate and I'm willing to be corrected. And I'm not saying that just because I don't speak a lot and I'm a little nervous, but it really is the theme of what I'm going to be talking about. Let's see, one more thing before I get started. I can't address every version of Christianity in 20 minutes. I know there's some new historical data about early Christians, and there just isn't enough for me to speak to that. So when I say Christian, I'm talking about the Catholics, the Roman Catholics, how they came to be what we call Christian, and then the Lutherans and all those major denominations. And I've got a little bit about that first century stuff near the end. We'll see if we get to that. But I wanted to address the 2 billion Christians that are around today. So a little more about me. I was a teenager in the 70s. That's how to pronounce my name, by the way. I know some people have trouble with that. And at that time, I believed just all sorts of stuff. Bermuda Triangle. My family had these... Little louder? Oh, sorry. I know it's fading out there as I'm trying to... Sure thing. All right. So, all right. Thanks for letting me know. I can't hear that. But so, like, my family had these cards, and we would test each other for our psychic abilities. I don't know if anybody remembers those from the 70s. And then a turning point for me, I was watching a PBS show one night. I sat down. They're going to talk about Easter Island, and I was so excited. And they didn't say anything about aliens. So that kind of got me thinking about maybe my beliefs need to be questioned a little. And around that time, there was this quieter movement of liberal Christianity. And of course, the Bush years were coming along, and evangelical Christianity was getting to be a big deal. And I joined a church in 1993 that was one of those more liberal churches. And then a little later, in 2000, I moved to a small town. So I was in a big town where they had those kind of variety of Christianities. And then I moved to a small town, and I really kind of saw what those evangelicals were like. And other things happened. We all know about this, and I'm not going to dwell on it, don't worry. This is pretty common for a lot of people to say this was a turning point for them and got them to start thinking about what's going on with fundamentalists. Also around this time, I started teaching Sunday school. And it was mostly just a few boys. It was a small church, and they were around 10 years old. And if you know 10-year-old boys in Sunday school, they're very good at asking all of the questions that the philosophers have asked for hundreds of years. So it became a real challenge for me because I didn't want to suppress that creativity and that thinking, but I didn't want to get into complex apologetics. And so I had to figure out a way to encourage that, but at the same time teach religion. And my searches for how to do that, one of the things I came across was a high school teacher at a Christian high school. And he said, never teach a young person something that they will likely question later as an adult. At least don't teach them as if that's truth. In other words, it's kind of like teach the controversy, except you can also teach that, like in climate change, the controversy is 97% to 3%. Teach the whole truth of it if there is something that they will later question, which I thought was a good way to look at it. And eventually that did end, and I just couldn't keep teaching Sunday school. The more I learned, the more I realized this just isn't going to work for me. Around that same time, actually right as 9/11 was happening, a new show was on the radio called Speaking of Faith. Might have heard of it? And I love that show. And there was this one on 2009, a woman named Karen Armstrong, real interesting woman. She was a Roman Catholic nun in the 60s and eventually got out of that and became a BBC reporter and an author. And she told the story of this God 2000 seminar that she did with a bunch of different mixed theologies. And they were discussing how do we discuss theology in the modern world. And near the end of this seminar, some guy comes in the back and he's just screaming kind of irrationally and saying, you're all going to hell and you've all got it wrong. And there's all these people there who should have really been able to engage him, but they couldn't. So eventually he's just shuffled off. So that's my reason number 2 is if someone like Karen Armstrong, in the middle of discussing what is fundamentalism and how do we deal with it, they couldn't deal with a fundamentalist coming in the room. But I still think it was a great question. That was her question. She asked that on the show without answering it. You know, how do we deal with these people? How do we engage them in the conversation? So you need to understand what fundamentalism is, and where the modern word comes from is some pamphlets that came out around 1910, 1916. And they were called the Fundamentals. And I'll list some of the beliefs here in a minute, but it's not really important exactly what they said, so much as that they were a reaction to things that were going on at the time. Albert Schweitzer was trying to discover a historical Jesus. Darwinism, of course, had just come out, and this was before Scopes monkey trial, but it was right in that time when people were trying to integrate that new science. And the higher criticism, the whole idea of looking at the Bible as literature and picking it apart and finding the contradictions, that had been going on for hundreds of years. So this group reacted to that and said, look, we've got to say, what is Christianity? There's just too much discussion going on here. So you can probably recognize some of these, and if I miss some, go ahead and shout them out. Things like the Trinity were in these pamphlets. That Jesus Christ was actually a person, that he's going to come again. I don't need to read every one of these. Dispensationalism, I'll talk a little more in a sec. Some kind of end of times, that it's all leading up to something. So am I missing any here? Miracles, intelligent design, of course, subordination of women, things like that. Now, I don't think he said that in the pamphlet, but so that first question, is this a recent phenomenon? And inerrancy is one that people say that's recent. And that's kind of a tough one, because if you look through all of things that are written by theologians, it's not really specifically said that the Bible is inerrant until well into the 16th century, where somebody finally writes that in, these are the rules of our church. Unless you want to go back to Timothy 3:16, which says the Bible is God-breathed, but then you can get into Greek language and all sorts of things. But so that's that you could say that's recent. Intelligent design came before Darwinism, because we were trying to figure out what are all these dinosaur bones and where did we come from, and it was a theory that came before that. I think Darwinism kind of killed that, but and that we're saved by faith is generally something associated with fundamentalism. Now that goes all the way back to Peter and Paul arguing about whether we're saved by faith or works. So to say that we're saved by faith is a new thing. I just don't see that. The idea of end times, again, some people have said that. There's been many people throughout history who have said the end is near. Revelations, of course, says it. And the dispensationalism, I'm not going to try to explain how that works. That is definitely a new term. We know who invented that term. It's fairly recent. But the idea of end times has been around. Subordination of women, well, women's right is new. I don't think the fundamentalists have the corner on the market of that one. And then, of course, hell, that's another one that can be argued. Some people will say that the word Gehenna got translated into hell later on. And Jesus was talking about this neighborhood in Jerusalem that was a really bad place to go. But again, I don't want to go too much into, I don't want to get into a whole theological discussion. I think the important thing is that what fundamentalism has become is the thing that most Christians say, I'm not that. And I didn't want to put an ugly picture up here of the Westboro Baptist. I don't know if anybody knows this one. There's something in the Bible about Jesus being mad at a fig tree. So, and I know you can't read that quite well, it says God hates figs. We know what that really means, but so it's become something that a lot of Christians say, I'm not those things. So where did all that come from? If they're writing this pamphlet called The Fundamentals, they must have had something to base it on. And I think we got to go back to the Council of Nicaea, which I know there's a lot of mythology about this too. St. Nicholas might have been there. They might have set the date for Easter, and Constantine kind of took over Christianity. I don't know that, I don't think all that's true, but there is some truth to it. We know that there was religious violence, and Constantine wanted to get that under control. And he did involve himself in these debates, and that set a precedent to have an emperor involved in a theological debate. But exactly how much, that I hear different things on that. So what's not as well known is that this politicking continued. And I don't know if you can read that, but all that stuff that I listed before, it's all in here. The Virgin Mary, the exact wording of where God comes from and where the Spirit comes from is the stuff that they argued about and fought wars about. And it's really pretty crazy when you read their justifications for why they were fighting. So that's all in there. And like I said, they continued to fight about that. When Constantine died, he was baptized by an Arian bishop. Now, most Christians don't know this anymore. They don't fight about this stuff anymore. But it was very important at the time that there was a Nicene Christianity, and Constantine supported that, and then later he kind of thought, well, maybe that wasn't quite right, and he got baptized by an Arian bishop. So kind of think of a president of the United States going to a more social justice kind of church rather than an evangelical church. So the evangelicals would say, well, he's Christian, but he's not a real Christian. So his sons continued to argue these things and continued to try to influence the theology to support their edicts and support them as emperors. But the real important one that isn't talked about as much is Emperor Theodosius, who came from the West, that Nicene Christianity, and came over to the East to Constantinople to take the throne. And this was the time of Augustine of Hippo, and he's writing about theology and writing about what the Trinity is. And Theodosius comes in and he starts enforcing this. And he starts passing laws. This Nicene Christianity is going to be Christianity. And if not, we're not just going to defund your church. We might burn it down. We might burn your books. So when you hear about that sort of thing, about Christianity doing book burnings, this was the time when that was really happening. And it also happens to be the time that Theodosius was the last emperor to rule over East and West. So this is what I was saying about the fall of Rome. I mean, it's correlation doesn't prove that it's true, but he does all this stuff, and that's when Rome starts to split apart. He was the last emperor to rule over both East and West. And if you look him up in the Catholic Encyclopedia, this is online, and you look up Theodosius, it says he cleansed the empire of the Arian Christianity. Well, that sounds nice, doesn't it? I think we know what they mean by cleansed. So, let's see, how are we doing on time? We're doing pretty good on time. The hard thing here is if you just look at the politics of Rome, it may not look like it supports what I'm saying. But because he wasn't just, when I say he wasn't supporting the other certain kind of churches, he was any kind of philosophy that disagreed with his philosophy, you could be attacked. And I'll show a law here in a minute. I don't want to go through every one of these details. That picture there is something called the Antikythera. It's a computer in the 1st century BC. So I just want to make the point that there was a lot of science and philosophy going on before the 4th century, and then after that it seems to just kind of disappear. One kind of smoking gun is something that was found, and I forget when it was found, I think it was 13th century. And they found this book of prayer. And they noticed that there was something underneath, something that had been erased. And since we have all sorts of great ways to look at paper now and see what was even underneath what is currently there, they found that Archimedes had started to figure out Newtonian calculus. I didn't know who Newton was, but I mean he had started to figure out the same rules of calculus that Newton figured out, and that Newton is the beginning of science. So, and literally they were erasing science and writing over it with prayers. So that law up there in the upper left, I know it's kind of fine print, but it says, if perchance any person should be convicted of having hidden any of these books, meaning any kind of non-Nicene Christianity, under any pretext or fraud whatever, and having failed to deliver them, meaning they get delivered and they get burnt, he shall know that he himself shall suffer capital punishment. So that's way back in 409, and I can't cover 2,000 years of history in 20 minutes as much as I'd love to. But I've got a couple other points there through history where it's kind of repeated the same kind of anti-intellectual rules. And then if you look in the bottom right, just as an example, is from just 2012, the Texas Republican Party platform saying, we oppose teaching of, and they name all these different kind of critical thinking skill kind of teachings that have any purpose of challenging the student's fixed beliefs and undermining parental authority. So thankfully this is just a platform of one state, but you know, it's Texas. I mean, that's a big state, and they have control of what school books get printed, and so I think this kind of thinking is still around. And maybe we can talk about that more in discussion, but I first just want to say, what I'm trying to say is my definition of fundamentalism is claiming to know the answers to questions commonly considered difficult based on relatively limited amount of source material. So I know I listed a lot of beliefs, but you're never going to find one church that agrees on all those things, or one person that says, yes, I believe exactly these things. And like I said, everybody's kind of forgotten exactly all these arguments about Nicene Christianity or Arian Christianity. And by limited amount, I don't mean stacks of books, because you can definitely find lots of theology books and lots of lengthy discussion, but are those full of demonstrable facts and evidence? Or are they just kind of the same things repeated over and over again? So we had this violence, this destroying of the pagan churches, and that's a picture of the Library of Alexandria burning back in the 4th and 5th century. And this kind of answers your question in the back there, the lady there. So even as these other ideas of Christianity were finally being able to start to be written about in the 13th century, and we had the Protestant movement was just starting with guys like Erasmus and a guy by the name of John Huss. Well, you don't know that name probably because he was burned at the stake by the Catholics. And then after Huss comes people like Luther. Luther studied Huss. And another guy like Calvin. Now those names we know, and those are churches that people go to. But you probably haven't heard the name Michael Servetus, because he disagreed with Calvin, and guess what happened to him? He got burned at the stake. So even though there were these other Christian ideas that people were trying to say, this is what really Christianity is, I still see them fighting throughout history, everywhere that I look. And if you look at today, I didn't want to get too sensationalistic about this. This is a picture from a gay pride gathering in St. Petersburg, and they're getting beat up. So if we keep having the idea of we're absolutely right and we're going to burn you at the stake, we can't do that in the modern world. We just have too many weapons and too many ways to enforce our absolute ideas. But of course, I mean, we don't burn people at the stake now, do we? I mean, that might be what you'd say. And so how did we get from those days, those burning at the stake days, to now? And of course, that's that philosophers were finally able to start publishing again. And rather than try to go through all the philosophy books I've read, which I'm no philosopher, but I probably couldn't teach it very well anyway, I don't think that's necessary. I don't think it's necessary that we all memorize this history and we all understand it. We just need to know it's there, because this stuff has been enshrined in our daily lives. The words like all men are created equal, I can't find a biblical source for that, but I can trace it back to people like Hume and Locke. And I'm willing to say there are some things that Hume and Locke said that I don't agree with. Unlike someone who would say, well, okay, what about love your neighbor? That came from the Bible. Well, okay, I agree with love your neighbor, but saying that I have to now read everything else in the Bible, I don't agree with that. And if we don't think that way, I think we keep running into a picture like this. And you can find a lot of these. I've seen one, there's an Australian church that does it. This idea that our church is the one that has the direct line right back to Jesus. So all these other things happened. It's kind of fine print there, but 325 was the Council in Nicaea. There were all these other councils and all these other edicts being passed, and then things start to split off, and they're all having wars while this is happening, of course. But our church is the one that's right. I wanted to highlight kind of how I think it could be done, how it should be done. And this is a very short speech from Martin Luther King just before he died. And this guy was brilliant. He didn't have computers and paper and PowerPoint. He just went up and did this on the fly. And you can see in the highlights, he's quoting names as he gives these quotes. And they're quotes like, "No lie can live forever," and "Truth crushed down to earth will rise again." And when I heard that, I kind of thought of Galileo, who decided that he would, rather than be tortured, he would just stop teaching about the earth rotating around the sun. He decided to accept his fate because he knew that what he had discovered, anybody else can discover just by looking in a telescope and seeing it. That is the truth. And he knew that the lies would not live forever. And then a couple later, Martin Luther King was a preacher, and he says, "You shall reap what you sow." But at that point, I don't mind so much that he's using the Bible, because he's mixing it in with these other things, and he's drawing on all history and all philosophy. And of course, this is an inspirational speech. I mean, lies can live for a very long time. But he's inspiring people to move on with the movement. Let's go. Oh, there he is. All right, there's Francis Schaeffer. So I skipped over that list. The Scopes monkey trial was a big point in history where the evangelicals and this new ideas of looking at the Bible as history were really clashing. And then the movement kind of went quiet, and then you started seeing Billy Graham in the White House and things like that. And one thing that is not quite as well known is this guy. He started something called the Labrai community in Switzerland. And he was trying to look at the Bible and figure out how do we take these rules that he liked, that he thought were right, and apply them in this modern world. And there's something on the web, you got to see it. I've got the link here. He wrote a book called How Then Shall We Live? And there's a thing, it's just a couple hours on the web. And it starts out talking about Rome like I did and how they had their philosophy, but then Rome fell, right? So he sees that as a failure of the philosophy. And then he goes through a couple more times in history where other kind of things failed. And his conclusion is you have to have an absolute authority. So when you look at his statement here, it's true. If you have some absolute beliefs, the state is not going to convince you that you're wrong. But of course I disagree with Francis that kind of absolute thinking is exactly what's dangerous. Now, his son is still around, and his son was part of the movement, and he's now stopped agreeing with his father, and he writes about that history. So it's really interesting that he's still around and can tell us that in the early movement, so this is the guy who kind of wrote the book on modern fundamentalism. But he had this community, and he had homosexual couples living there and working for him. He brought hippies in and was willing to talk to them because he wanted to know, what is it you're feeling, and here's what I believe about God and how we should live together. And he wanted to actually talk with them. And Frank even tells the story of Anita Bryant. Y'all remember Anita Bryant? She came to Francis, and she wanted advice. She says, you're talking about the God that I like, the absolute God that is the true gospel. So I want to get homosexual teachers out of the school. And Francis kicked her out of the house. And evangelicals today probably don't know this. Michelle Bachmann studied this guy's book and was very inspired by her, by him. But I think she got it wrong. Even though he's talking, well, of course I think he had it a little bit wrong too. I mean, he was at least trying to work this out. He still had this idea of there needs to be an absolute truth. But he was willing to discuss it with people, and he was willing to, in his way, I think, minister to people in a caring way. So, my answer to Karen Armstrong's question, that one about how do we engage fundamentalists, is there has to be a rule. There has to be, in technical language, it's called we can't allow special pleading. I like the way Daniel Dennett puts it. He says, if you can say that God is your source of what you're saying is true, then I can say it's my friend Mary. My friend Mary knows everything. And that's the end of the discussion. That's what special pleading is. When we come into the public sector, into government, anywhere you're saying you're being open and inclusive, you just can't do that. So either, I'll sort of make another conclusion here and we can do some more questions. We've still got some time. What I'm saying is either the fundamentalists are right and Christianity is what they say it is and always has been, and that includes all the divisions and all the denominations, or the Bible is just a collection of mythology and poetry and ancient Near Eastern historians who we know were prone to stretch the truth. Now there is this third option, that's the early Christianity some people have asked about, that there's some lost version of Christianity or there's some other religion out there that we just haven't found yet. We haven't worked it out enough, and it's just waiting to be discovered. And if we were to discover that through archaeology and through understanding ancient languages and just an increased understanding through peer-reviewed research, well, I'd be willing to discuss that philosophy, and I think even in some way there is a little bit of truth to our government being based on some Christian ideas, like loving your neighbor. So I can accept things like that. But if you tell me that the only way to know these things is I have to open my heart to a living Christ and discover truth through prayer and meditation, I think that's right down the path back to fundamentalism. And it's about relationships, people who are in a relationship where one goes to church and the other doesn't. But it's really a great book because the study he does asks much more detailed questions about belief. And he's really got numbers on that sort of thing you're talking about, where there's a lot of people who are going to church now and believe very little of that Nicene Creed. And this has been well known, I think, with Catholics. A lot of Catholics practice birth control. And he's got a lot more numbers on that, of how it's very hard to find someone who, what they say they believe, and have that match up what their church says they're supposed to believe. And another story on the doubt that Francis's son tells is he was in the hospital with his dad while he's dying, and also Billy Graham was there, and he heard them discussing, I don't really know what's going to happen to me when I die. I think that's a great story that really needs to be out there, that sort of thing, like rabbis officially saying there's such a thing as doubt, and that we know that these evangelical leaders had doubts, because they sure didn't say that in public for many decades. So hopefully that's coming out more. Which I think addresses some of the first century things we were talking about. A very liberal pastor of mine is on Facebook, and he linked this article about what progressive churches should be teaching. And that part on the bottom there was in that article that talks about the early church and how they were creating an alternative community based on ideals of God's kingdom, and they were about caring about one another and worshiping God. Well, I kind of rewrote it to the top statement, which just talks about communities that care about each other and are trying to create a better society, antithetical to this Roman Empire that was had slaves and all that terrible stuff. So I can agree with that top line. It's when you get down to the thing where you start using that word God, and I don't understand what you mean. So if you want to include me in that, then you can't use that term. So what he's talking about is there are things in the Bible that are fairly unique, things like loving your enemy.
That's not in the Bible, that's in the Gospels.
It's in the Gospels, okay. And of course, loving thy neighbor is, well, there's many versions of that, but still they taught that. And then how does that get, as we say, hijacked and become the Roman Catholic Church with the army behind it? Kind of the best I can answer that, my personal theory, I don't know how you would prove this, but once you say, yes, this is a great thing, and everybody agrees with it, and they start building these little communities, but you also say, it comes from this one source. So because this person said that, therefore we need to listen to everything that this source says. Well, now you've got the whole Bible, and there's all sorts of things in there. So it becomes more easily corruptible when you put it in those absolute terms. Does that make sense? No? I'll see if I can come up with a better way to say that.
You got to switch.
All right.